She had 48 hours to save everything her husband died building, and the man trying to take it from her was already writing the deed in his own name. A widow at 29, standing alone on 10,000 acres of dying Montana land, Evelyn Mercer was never supposed to last a single season. The banks didn't believe her, the town didn't back her, and the men she hired kept walking. But she didn't. If you've ever fought for something everyone told you to let go, this story is for you. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning Thomas Mercer got buried, the sky didn't bother turning gray. It stayed blue, wide, indifferent, almost offensive in its beauty. While 6 men lowered a pine box into the earth on the eastern ridge of the ranch he'd spent 14 years building with his hands, Evelyn stood at the edge of the grave in a black dress that had belonged to her mother, watching the dirt fall. And she didn't cry. Not because she wasn't broken, but because she'd already spent 3 nights doing that alone in the dark, and there was nothing left to squeeze out. Thomas had died the way men on the frontier often did, suddenly, without ceremony, and at the worst possible time. A horse had thrown him during a routine run along the creek line. He'd struck his head on a rock ledge and never regained consciousness. The ranch doctor rode out from Billings 2 days later and told her what she already knew. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Mercer," he said, holding his hat in both hands. There wasn't anything anyone could have done. She nodded like it made sense. It didn't. What Thomas left behind was this: 10,040 acres of Montana grassland, a herd of roughly 800 cattle, a bunkhouse that smelled like old leather and tobacco, a main house with a leaking roof over the east wing, a debt on the south pasture fence line that wasn't paid off, and a foreman named Walt Gibbs, who was 61 years old and walked with a limp from a fall he'd taken 5 winters back. What Thomas did not leave behind: a son, a brother, a partner. Anyone with a last name people in Larkspur Valley would recognize as carrying weight. Just Evelyn. The morning after the funeral, she woke before dawn, put on her work boots, and walked out to the main barn. 3 of the hands were already saddling up. She recognized them: Ray Dunnell, Cal Hooper, and a young man named Pete, whose last name she'd never quite caught. They looked up when she came in, and the silence that followed was the kind that said everything without a word being spoken. "Where are you headed?" she asked. Ray was the one who answered. He was a decent enough man, she'd always thought. Had worked the ranch for 2 years. He looked at the ground when he spoke, which she'd later decide was at least better than looking her in the eye and saying it. "Mrs. Mercer, I got no disrespect for you or for Thomas, but I got a family, and a ranch without a man at the head of it." He paused, cleared his throat. "It's not the kind of place that makes a man feel secure in his wages." "Your wages are the same as they were last week," she said. "Yes, ma'am, but last week Thomas was here." She stood there in the barn doorway, watching the dust settle on the hay. She wanted to say something sharp, something that would cut through the stupidity of the logic being handed to her. Instead, she said, "Fine. Draw what you're owed from Walt before you go." They left before noon. Walt Gibbs found her at the fence line that afternoon, checking for breaks in the wire along the south pasture the way Thomas used to do every 3rd day. "Ray and the boys are gone," he said, though she already knew. "I know. We're down to 4 hands now, including myself." He paused. "And my hip's been bad since March." She kept her eyes on the fence line. "How long can we manage with 4? Walt scratched the back of his neck. He was the kind of old rancher who thought in seasons, not days, and she'd always appreciated that about him. "Through September, maybe. If we don't push the herd further north and we let the east pasture rest. But winter's going to need at least 8-10 men. Good ones. And we got a water problem." She turned to look at him. "What kind of water problem?" He pulled his hat off and held it against his chest. "The creek's running low. Not drought low. Not yet. But lower than it should be for this time of year. I've been watching it 2 weeks. I didn't want to say anything until Thomas—" He stopped himself, looked away. "Well, I'm saying it now." Evelyn looked across the land, the brown-gold sweep of it under the August sun, the shimmer of heat over the hills to the west. She could feel the dryness of it, the way the earth cracked at the edges of the wagon track, the way the grass near the creek bent sideways rather than standing up the way it should. "I'll need to hire," she said. "You will. And I'll need men who'll actually stay." Walt nodded slowly. That's the harder part. The town of Larkspur sat 14 miles east of the ranch, small enough that everyone knew your name, big enough that rumors moved faster than the mail. Within a week of Thomas's death, Evelyn had already heard 3 different versions of what she was supposedly going to do with the ranch: sell to a land company out of Billings, marry the widowed banker Ellsworth Crane, or simply collapse under the pressure and let the bank claim what was left. She drove the wagon in herself on a Thursday morning, tied it outside the feed store, and walked directly to the notice board near the post office where men looking for work sometimes left their names. There were 2. One was a boy who couldn't have been older than 17. The other listed no name at all, just experienced hand, available immediately. She hired the boy on the spot. His name was Danny Pruitt, and he was eager in the way only young men without better options can be. The other name turned out to belong to a man who'd already left town. She was standing at the board working through her options when a woman named Clara Bates came up beside her. Clara ran the dry goods store with her husband and had known Evelyn for years. Not close friends exactly, but the kind of neighbor you trusted because she'd never given you reason not to. "You're looking for hands," Clara said. It wasn't a question. "I am." Clara hesitated. "Evelyn, I have to say something to you, and I hope you'll forgive me for it." "Say it." "People are talking about Victor Hale." Evelyn kept her eyes on the notice board. Victor Hale owned the 3 ranches to the north and west of hers, combined probably 4 times the acreage. He was 60 years old, had never married, and had a reputation for acquiring land the same way other men acquired furniture. Steadily, without sentiment, and often when someone else didn't want to give it up. "They can talk about him," Evelyn said. "They're saying he's already made inquiries about Mercer land." Clara's voice dropped. "To the bank." Evelyn turned to look at her then. "When?" "Week before Thomas passed." Clara pressed her lips together. "I don't know what that means exactly, but I thought you should know." Basset. She was almost back to the wagon when she first saw him. He was sitting on the edge of the watering trough outside the livery stable. Not dramatically, not in any way that called attention to itself. Just a man sitting. He had a battered leather bag on the ground beside him, a hat pulled low, and the kind of stillness that looked less like laziness and more like a man who'd learned not to waste motion on things that didn't need it. She wouldn't have paid him any mind except that Walt was with her, and Walt stopped walking. "That fella there," Walt said quietly. "I've seen him work." "Where?" "Birchwood outfit, 3 years back. Handled a cattle drive through the Absaroka Range with a crew half the size they should have had." Walt paused. "He's good, Evelyn. Quiet, but good." She studied the man for a moment. He hadn't looked up. His boots were worn down at the heels, but the leather was cared for. His hands, resting on his knees, were the kind of hands that had worked. "What happened at the Birchwood outfit?" she asked. "Don't know. He left." "Why?" "Don't know that either." She walked over. He looked up when she was close enough that it would have been rude not to. His face was hard to age, somewhere in his mid-30s maybe, with dark eyes that took her in without the usual flicker of surprise or condescension that she'd started getting used to from men in this town. He just looked at her, quiet and steady, the way you look at someone you're willing to listen to. "I'm Evelyn Mercer," she said. "I run the Mercer Ranch out on Larkspur Creek. I'm looking for experienced hands." He nodded once. "Cole Ashford. Walt tells me you've worked cattle drives through rough country." "Some." "I won't pretend the situation is simple," she said. "My husband passed 2 weeks ago. 3 of my crew have left. The ranch is under pressure I won't go into detail about in the middle of town. I can pay you fair wages, give you a bunk and meals, but I won't lie to you about what you'd be walking into." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind those dark eyes, but she couldn't name it. "When do you need an answer?" he asked. "I'd like one now." A beat. "All right," he said. He reached down and picked up the leather bag. "I'll ride out with you." She hadn't expected that. The simplicity of it. Most men asked a dozen more questions. He hadn't asked any at all. Down. Cole Ashford said very little on the ride back to the ranch. Evelyn had learned by then that silence in a man could mean 2 things. Either he had nothing worth saying, or he was the kind of person who didn't speak until he had something real to offer. She wasn't sure yet which kind he was. Walt rode alongside him part of the way, and she noticed Cole asked one question. Just one, somewhere along the valley road. "The creek on the property," he said. "It's the one that runs down from the northern ridge?" "Larkspur Creek, yeah," Walt said. "Comes down through Hale's land first, then cuts through the lower pasture on the north side." Cole nodded, said nothing else. When they arrived at the ranch, she gave him the tour herself. The barn, the bunkhouse, the water trough situation, the cattle numbers, the south pasture fence that still needed work, the east wing of the house where the roof leaked if it rained hard. She showed him the tools, showed him the horse stock, showed him the books without numbers that would embarrass her. He walked and looked and listened without interrupting. Finally, standing at the edge of the north pasture where the grass was thinnest, he crouched down and pressed 2 fingers into the earth. "This ground's been dry longer than the drought accounts for," he said. She looked at him. "What does that mean?" He stood up, brushed the dirt from his fingers. He looked north, toward the ridge, toward the direction the creek came from. "Means the water that should be coming down that creek isn't getting here the way it should." Walt said it was running low. "It's not just low." He paused. "Something's slowing it upstream." Evelyn felt something tighten in her chest. Not quite fear, not quite anger. The specific feeling of a problem getting larger just when you'd thought you'd understood its size. "Can you prove that?" she said. "Not yet," he said. "I'd need to ride the creek line." "Then ride it," she said. Bad. The first weeks were brutal in the way that hard work is always brutal. Not dramatic, just relentless. Cole worked from before dawn until after dark, and not in the way that new hires do to make an impression. He worked like a man who had a specific idea in his head and was making the land match it. He fixed the south fence in 3 days that Walt had estimated would take a week and a half. He reorganized the herd rotation so the cattle weren't overgrazing the already stressed west pasture. He worked alongside Danny Pruitt without talking down to him, which Danny noticed and which made the boy work harder than he would have otherwise. The other remaining hands, a pair of brothers named Samuel and Hector Vance, watched Cole the way men watch someone they haven't decided how to feel about yet, careful, assessing. On the 3rd evening, Samuel came to find Evelyn in the house. "You want to tell me who that man is?" Samuel said. He wasn't hostile, just direct. "I told you his name," she said. "Cole Ashford." "Where's he from?" "He hasn't said." Samuel worked his jaw for a moment. "He knows what he's doing, that much is clear. He knew the graze rotation without me explaining it. Already had it figured when I showed him the east pasture layout. That's not common." "No," Evelyn agreed. "It's not. Just wondering if there's something behind it we should know about." "If there is," she said, "he'll tell us when he thinks we need to know." Samuel considered that, nodded slowly. "All right," he said, and went back to the bunkhouse. Cole rode the creek line on a Sunday, which was the only day she gave the crew anything close to a half rest. He left at first light and came back in the early afternoon, and when he tied his horse outside the barn, his jaw was set in a way she was starting to recognize. He found her in the main house going over feed accounts. "Sit down," she said, because she could already tell it wasn't good. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, the first time he'd been inside the house, and placed his hat on the table beside him. "About 4 miles north of here, where the creek bends east before it hits the ridge," he said. "Someone's built a diversion, not a natural one. Timber and stone, stacked deliberate. It's pulling maybe a third of the flow off into a side channel that runs onto Hale land." The silence that followed was very quiet. "A third," she said. "At least. Could be more by late September if the natural flow drops further." Evelyn set down the pen she'd been holding. She looked at the accounts on the table, the numbers she'd been fighting to make work for weeks. Numbers that assumed the herd could sustain itself through the fall. Numbers that required enough water. "Victor Hale," she said. "I don't know that for certain," Cole said. "The diversion is on the edge of what might be disputed territory, near the boundary line. Hard to say without seeing the original land patents who owns that stretch." "I know who owns that stretch," she said. "Thomas filed the survey himself in 1882. That creek bank on the north side is Mercer land for 6 miles. Cole met her eyes. "Then someone built a structure on your land without your knowledge or permission." Yes, she said. They did. She stood up from the table, walked to the window and looked out at the north pasture, the thin, dry grass, the cattle that needed more water than they were getting. How long do we have, she said, before it matters, really matters, to the herd? Cole thought about it honestly. She appreciated that he didn't rush a reassuring answer. 6 weeks, he said, if we're careful. If we move the southern cattle to the creek pasture now and reduce the overall head count on water. But past 6 weeks, he didn't finish the sentence. Past 6 weeks we lose cattle, she said. Yes. She turned from the window. Her face was steady. The kind of steady that isn't the absence of emotion, but the management of it. Then we have 6 weeks to fix this, she said. Cole nodded. We do. I need you to understand something, she said. She looked at him directly, the way she'd learned to look at men when she needed them to actually hear her. Victor Hale has been the most powerful man in this valley for 20 years. He buys what he wants and waits out what he can't buy. He thought Thomas dying would do the waiting for him. She paused. He was wrong. Cole held her gaze. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Something settled, resolved. I understand, he said. Good, she said. Then let's figure out what we're going to do about it. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass of the north pasture. The creek ran lower than it should. The sun dropped behind the western hills, and the shadow it left was long and dark across the land. But the house was lit, and the people inside it weren't giving up. That night, for the first time since Thomas died, Evelyn Mercer sat at the kitchen table and did not feel entirely alone. She didn't trust that feeling yet. It was too new, too fragile, the kind of thing that breaks if you name it too early. But it was there, something small and stubborn in her chest, the way a coal holds heat after the fire's gone down. She put away the feed accounts, made a note about the land patent in Thomas's handwriting she'd need to find in the office files, checked the door lock out of habit. Then she went to bed and slept 4 hours without dreaming. For her, right then, that was enough. The land patent was in the third drawer of Thomas's office desk, folded inside a leather document sleeve that smelled like tobacco and old ink. Evelyn found it the next morning before anyone else was up, sitting at her husband's desk in the gray pre-dawn light with a lantern burning low beside her. She spread the document flat on the desk and read every line of it twice. Thomas had been meticulous. That was one of the things about him she'd loved and occasionally found maddening. He'd filed the original survey with the Territorial Land Office in 1882, had it witnessed by 2 men whose names she still recognized, and had included a hand-drawn boundary map that showed Larkspur Creek running along the northern edge of Mercerland for exactly 6 miles and 400 yards before crossing into the ridge country that bordered Hale's territory. The creek bank on the north side, both banks for the first 4 miles, were Mercerland, clear as anything written on paper could be clear. She folded it back up and held it in both hands. Paper, she knew, was only as strong as the people willing to stand behind it. She set it aside and went to make coffee. Cole was already in the barn when she came out an hour later, replacing a cracked board on the feed trough with the kind of focused quiet she'd noticed was simply his natural state. He didn't perform work, he just did it. I found the land patent, she said from the barn doorway. He set down the board and looked at her. And? The creek's ours. Both banks, north side included, for the first 4 miles. The diversion you found is sitting on Mercer land. He wiped his hands on his jeans. Who's the county land recorder? Man named Fitch. Gerald Fitch. He's been in the office in Larkspur for 15 years. Is he Hale's man? She thought about it honestly. I don't know. He was always civil enough with Thomas. But civil doesn't mean much when there's money involved. She paused. Thomas always said that Fitch was the kind of man who moved with whoever was standing. Cole looked out past the barn doors toward the north pasture. The morning light was coming in flat and pale, and the grass out there caught it without shining. Dry grass never shone the way wet grass did. We need to document the diversion, he said. Before we do anything legal, before we talk to anyone in town, we need physical evidence that it exists and that it's deliberate. You said you saw it. I saw it. That's not the same thing as proof. He picked the board back up. I want to go back out there with measurements, sketches. If there are tool marks on the timber, that matters. If there are recent tracks nearby, that matters. He looked at her. Can you draw? She blinked. Adequately. Good. Come with me this afternoon. It wasn't a question exactly, but it wasn't an order either. It landed somewhere in between. The way a suggestion does when it comes from someone who's already thought 3 steps further ahead than you have. All right, she said. They rode out after the noon meal, just the 2 of them, following the creek line north through the brown-edged grass of the upper pasture. The creek itself was narrow enough that you could jump it in a few places. Not drought narrow, not sandbar narrow, but low and slow in a way that didn't match the season. August should have had this water moving with some purpose. Instead, it crept. Cole led them off the main trail about 3.5 miles up, where the creek bent east around a low limestone outcrop. He'd marked the spot in his memory the way men who spent their lives navigating open country did. Not with landmarks you'd name on a map, but with the feel of the land shifting under the horse. When she saw it, she understood immediately why he'd called it deliberate. The diversion wasn't crude. That was the first thing that struck her. Someone hadn't just thrown rocks and brush across a channel on a lazy afternoon. The structure was built, notched timber stacked with the kind of care that spoke of planning, of knowing what you wanted the water to do and making sure it did it. It angled the flow off the main creek channel and into a shallow secondary run that curved northwest, directly toward the ridge country on Hale's side of the boundary. Evelyn stood at the edge of it for a long moment without speaking. This took time, she finally said. Days, at least, Cole said. He was already crouching near the base of the structure, examining where the timber met the creek bed. See these notches? That's not frontier improvising. Someone knew how to do this properly. Which means it wasn't done by one man alone. No, he said, and it wasn't done recently. Look at the waterline marks on the timber here. This has been sitting in this creek long enough to stain. He stood and looked at her. Weeks, maybe longer. Evelyn pulled out the notebook she'd brought and began sketching. The shape of the structure, the angle of the diversion channel, the position relative to the creek bend, and the limestone outcrop. She wasn't fast, but she was precise. Thomas had always said her eye for detail was better than his. She sketched until her hand cramped, then kept sketching. Cole walked the perimeter while she worked, checking the ground around the structure, following the diversion channel northwest a short distance to where it fed into a broad, shallow basin that clearly collected the redirected water before releasing it further down onto Hale land. He came back looking like a man whose suspicion had been confirmed in a way that didn't make him feel good about being right. There's a holding basin, he said, 200 yards up, lined with more timber and stone. This isn't just diverting water, it's collecting it, storing it. She stopped sketching. For what? Hale's South Range, he said. I rode it once, 2 years ago, passing through. It's the driest part of his land, always has been. If he's pulling your water and storing it, he's feeding his South Range, she said, through summer and into fall, while yours dries out. She looked down at the sketch in her notebook, at the careful lines she'd made of a structure that was killing her ranch one dry week at a time. He didn't just plan to wait for us to fail, she said, and the steadiness in her voice surprised even her. He planned to make us fail. Cole said nothing. There wasn't anything to say to that which would have made it better. She closed the notebook. Let's go back, she said. The ride home was quieter than the ride out. Not uncomfortable, just the silence of 2 people holding the same heavy knowledge and not yet sure what to do with it. About a mile from the ranch, Cole spoke. Have you dealt with a lawyer before? In any land matter? Thomas used a man named Aldrich out of Billings, Calvin Aldrich. He handled the original deed transfer when Thomas bought the South Pasture acreage in 1884. Is he reliable? Thomas trusted him. She paused. Thomas was a good judge of people. Cole nodded. You need to write to him tonight. Don't say everything in the letter. Just tell him there's a water rights dispute with a neighboring landowner and you need his counsel. Ask him how soon he can come. That'll take a week minimum, even with fast mail. I know, he said, which means in the meantime we don't touch that diversion and we don't say a word to anyone in Larkspur about what we found. She glanced at him. Not even Walt? He thought about it. Walt's trustworthy. Tell Walt. But nobody else. Not in town, not the feed store, not the post office, not anyone you think might be neutral. He paused. In a dispute with Victor Hale, neutral people don't exist. They're either his or they're scared of him, and scared people talk. She thought of Clara Bates, who had warned her about Hale's inquiries at the bank. Clara was a good woman, but Clara also had a husband and a business in a town where Victor Hale held considerable influence. Understood, she said. That evening she wrote the letter to Calvin Aldrich. She kept it precise and unemotional, the way Thomas had taught her to write in matters of business. She sealed it, addressed it, and set it on the table by the door to go with the morning mail run. Then she sat for a while in the quiet kitchen. The thing she hadn't said to Cole, the thing she was still turning over in her mind, was this. Even if Aldrich came and confirmed everything, even if the legal path was clear and the evidence was solid, a legal fight with Victor Hale would cost money. Money the ranch barely had. A prolonged dispute could eat through their reserves before the first hearing was ever scheduled. Hale knew that. Of course he knew that. Men like Victor Hale didn't make moves without thinking through every layer of what they were doing. She'd been so focused on the water, on the diversion, on the proof, that she hadn't stopped to think about the other side of the trap. She was still sitting with that thought when she heard boots on the porch steps, and then a knock on the door. 2 knocks, spaced the way Cole knocked, not Walt. She opened it. He was standing with his hat in his hand, which she'd come to understand meant he was bringing something he wanted her to take seriously. "I've been thinking," he said. "Come in." He sat across from her at the kitchen table again, and she noticed he'd started to feel less out of place there. Not comfortable exactly, but less like a man sitting somewhere he hadn't decided whether he belonged. "Hale's going to find out we've been to the diversion," he said. "Maybe not this week, but soon. A man who builds something that deliberate keeps an eye on it." "I know." "When he finds out, he'll move. Not on the land. Not directly. He'll move on your finances. He's already talked to the bank once. He'll do it again." Cole set his hat on the table. "Is there any existing debt on this ranch beyond the fence account?" She looked at him steadily. This was personal. The kind of thing you didn't share with a hired hand. But Cole wasn't operating like a hired hand, and she'd known that since the second day. "There's a note on the North Pasture acquisition from 1886, she said. "Thomas took a small loan to purchase the additional acreage. It's not large, but it's not retired either. Bank holds the paper." "Which bank?" "Larkspur Territorial." "Who runs it?" "Ellsworth Crane." She watched his face. "You're going to tell me Crane is connected to Hale?" "I don't know that for certain," he said. "But Hale talked to that bank right after Thomas died. That's not coincidence." She felt the shape of it then, the full shape of what was being done to her. Not one threat. 3. The water being stolen, the finances being squeezed, the legal cost of fighting it. All of it working together, each piece making the other worse. "He's not trying to outlast me," she said slowly. "He's trying to collapse me, all at once, from multiple directions." "That's how I read it," Cole said. She looked at him across the table. In the lantern light, his face was all planes and shadow, hard to read in the way that faces are when someone's been careful for a long time about what they show. "Why does a man with your skills end up sitting on a water trough in Larkspur with a travel bag and nowhere to be?" she said. It was the most direct thing she'd asked him about himself. She half expected him to deflect. He didn't, quite. He looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. "I had a place once," he said. "Small operation, up near the Yellowstone country. It didn't last." "What happened to it?" "Lost it," he said. "Simple as that. Not to anything dramatic. Just things went wrong in the wrong order. Couldn't recover." "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "Long time ago." He picked up his hat. "Point being, I know what it looks like when someone's being squeezed from all sides at once. I watched it happen to myself and didn't understand it fast enough to stop it." He stood. "You understand it. That's something." He went to the door. "Cole," she said. He stopped. "Thank you for coming out to the creek with me today. She paused. She wasn't always good at saying things that didn't have a practical frame around them. "For thinking past the obvious problem." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Don't thank me yet. We haven't fixed anything." He went out. She heard his boots across the porch, down the steps, the quiet across the yard toward the bunkhouse. She turned the lantern down and sat in the almost dark for a while, thinking. She thought about Victor Hale, not with hatred, which surprised her, more with the cold clarity of someone studying an opponent. He was 60 years old. He'd done this before, to other people, on smaller scales. He was patient, and he was systematic, and he believed, in the particular way that powerful men often believe, that what he was doing was simply the natural order of things, that land and water flowed towards strength, and that a 29-year-old widow trying to hold 10,000 acres was simply an obstacle in that flow. He'd made one mistake, though. He'd assumed she didn't understand the game he was playing. 3 weeks passed before Calvin Aldrich arrived from Billings, and those 3 weeks were the kind that aged a person. Not dramatically, not in the ways that show on a face right away, but in the way that difficulty always ages people who are paying full attention to it. The herd was showing strain. Nothing catastrophic yet, but the cattle on the north pasture had started drifting south on their own, instinctively moving away from the weak water source, and that meant overgrazing pressure on the southern range, which was already taxed. Cole adjusted the rotation again, moving groups in smaller numbers, stretching what they had. Samuel and Hector Vance had, somewhere in those 3 weeks, stopped watching Cole with assessment and started working with him like men who'd made up their minds. Danny Pruitt had gotten good enough that Walt trusted him to ride the west fence alone, which was not something Walt gave lightly. The ranch held. Not easily, but it held. Aldrich came on a Tuesday, arriving in a hired buggy from the Larkspur coach stop, a compact man in his 50s with reading spectacles pushed up on his forehead and a leather satchel that looked like it had survived several careers. He shook Evelyn's hand with both of his, the gesture of a man who knew this wasn't a small matter. She laid everything on the table in Thomas's office. The land patent, her sketches of the diversion, Cole's written account of what he'd found and measured, and the timeline she'd reconstructed of when the water had started running low against the natural season. Aldrich read every page. He asked 3 questions. He read 2 pages again. Then he took his spectacles off his forehead and put them on properly and looked at her over them. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "this is a water rights theft case. Plain and clear, based on what you've shown me." He tapped the land patent. "This document establishes your claim to that creek corridor. The structure your man described is on your land and is redirecting your water. That's actionable." "But," she said, because there was always a but. "But Victor Hale will contest it. He'll claim the boundary survey is imprecise, or that the diversion predates your patent, or that the secondary channel is a natural formation. Some argument, doesn't much matter which one. What matters is that it'll go to a hearing before the Territorial Land Commissioner, and those hearings," he paused, "they require evidence, not just documents, testimony. People willing to speak on the record about what they know and what they've witnessed." Witnesses to what? To the history of that creek, to the boundary, to the fact that Mercer land includes that stretch of the north bank. He folded his hands. A land patent is strong evidence, but in a dispute with a man of Hale's resources and influence, you want more than strong. You want overwhelming. Evelyn looked at the sketches on the table. What kind of testimony are we talking about? Longtime settlers in this valley, neighboring ranchers, anyone who rode or worked that land over the past 2 decades and knows where the boundaries have always been understood to lie. He paused. These things exist. People remember. The question is whether they're willing to say so on record, with Victor Hale in the room. The room was quiet. Evelyn thought about what Cole had said that night after they returned from the diversion. Scared people talk. Meaning, scared people couldn't be trusted to stay quiet. The other edge of that was, scared people also couldn't be trusted to stand up when the moment came. She looked at Aldrich. "When is the hearing deadline?" He checked something in his satchel. "Filing must be submitted within 60 days of formal notice being served. I can file notice tomorrow, which starts the clock." He looked at her carefully. "That gives us 60 days to build the full case." 60 days. She'd had 6 weeks of water, Cole said. The filing would extend the timeline, force Hale to respond legally rather than simply waiting for the ranch to dry out. It changed the pressure, shifted some of it back onto him. "File the notice," she said. That evening, after Aldrich had been given supper and the spare room, Evelyn found Cole at the edge of the north pasture, checking the creek level the way he'd taken to doing every few days. measuring it against a mark he'd carved into a creekside post, tracking whether the flow was worsening. She told him what Aldrich had said, all of it. Cole listened without interrupting, which was simply how he listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the watermark on the post. 60 days to find people willing to testify, he said. Yes. Against Victor Hale. Yes. He stood up from the creek bank and looked north, toward the ridge, toward where the diversion sat 4 miles up in the dark. His jaw was set in that way it got when he was working through something he didn't like the shape of. Who would you start with? She asked. He turned to look at her. And for the first time since she'd hired him, something that wasn't quite a smile but was moving in that direction crossed his face. The people he's already scared, he said, because those are the ones who have the most reason to want him to lose. The creek moved slow and low beneath them, whispering against the bank. Above, the Montana sky held its last strip of orange and let the dark come in from the east, the way dark always came, patient, unhurried, covering everything equally. Somewhere to the north, Victor Hale's land sat fat and watered on a creek that didn't belong to him. But the notice would be filed in the morning. In 60 days, Evelyn Mercer was beginning to understand, was more than enough time for the truth to find its feet. Aldrich filed the notice on a Wednesday morning, and by Thursday afternoon, Evelyn knew that Victor Hale had already heard about it. She knew because the feed store in Larkspur suddenly couldn't confirm her standing order for the following month. The man behind the counter, Owen Pratt, who had taken her money without hesitation for 4 years, told her without meeting her eyes that there was an issue with the account terms and he'd need to speak with his supplier before committing to anything. She stood at the counter for a moment, looking at Owen Pratt's forehead because he wouldn't give her his eyes, and then she said, "All right, Owen," and walked out. She sat in the wagon for a minute before she picked up the reins. Hale moved fast. Faster than she'd expected, which told her he'd had contingencies ready, that he'd been thinking about what he'd do when she pushed back, even before she pushed. That was the kind of man he was. Not reactive. Prepared. She drove home and told Cole what happened. He was in the barn mending a split cinch strap, and he kept working while she talked. When she finished, he set the strap down. "He's cutting your supply lines," Cole said, "making it harder to provision through fall. He figures if Aldrich's filing doesn't scare you off, running short on feed will." "He's probably also talked to Crane at the bank," she said. "Probably." He picked the strap back up. "Which means we need to move on the witnesses before he does." She looked at him. "You think he'll go after them too?" "I think he'll go after anyone he thinks might testify. Not violently. Men like Hale don't do it that way. He'll remind them what he can do for them or what he can make difficult. He'll be polite about it." Cole's voice was flat. "Polite pressure is still pressure." "Then we need to get to them first," Evelyn said. "Yes," he said. "We do." They sat down that evening, her, Cole, Walt, and Aldrich, who was staying through the week to help structure the legal approach, and made a list. Not a short list, and not an easy one. Aldrich had identified 7 potential witnesses whose testimony, combined, would establish a history of Mercer water rights and boundary understanding going back to the earliest settlement of the valley. 7 people who knew something real, who had been present for some piece of the long story of this land. The first name on the list was Agnes Tully. Agnes was 81 years old and had lived in Larkspur Valley since before it had a name. Her husband had been one of the original settlers who'd helped survey the eastern approach to the territory back in 1861. He'd been dead for 20 years, but Agnes was still on her small homestead at the edge of the valley, tended by a granddaughter, sharp as anyone Evelyn had ever spoken to. She knew Thomas's father, Walt said, knew him well, and she was there when the original creek boundaries were agreed on between the early settlers. She would have seen the Mercer claim established. "Will she talk?" Aldrich asked. "She'll talk," Walt said. "Agnes talks. The question is whether she's willing to put her name on paper." They rode out to Agnes Tully's homestead the next morning, Evelyn and Cole together. The granddaughter, a tired-looking woman in her 30s named Ruth, answered the door and looked at them with the particular wariness of someone who's been protecting an old person from the world's complications for a long time. "She's having a good day?" Ruth said carefully. "Don't make it a bad one." Agnes was sitting in a rocking chair near the window with a quilt over her legs and a cup of something hot in her hands. She had the kind of face that had moved past old into something else. something that had stopped being interested in how it looked and was just itself now, every line of it earned. She looked at Evelyn for a long moment when they came in. "You're Thomas Mercer's wife," she said. Not a question. "Yes, ma'am." Evelyn. "I heard he died." Agnes's voice was direct. "Shame. His father was a decent man. Sit down." They sat. Cole took a chair near the wall and said nothing, which Evelyn had come to understand was intentional. He read situations quickly, and he'd read this one as a conversation between two women that didn't need his involvement. Evelyn explained the situation plainly. The water, the diversion, the legal filing, what Aldrich needed. Agnes listened with her eyes on the window, the cup turning slowly in her hands. When Evelyn finished, Agnes said, "Victor Hale." The name came out the way you'd say the name of weather you'd been waiting on. "I've watched that man add property for 30 years, always the same way. Always just inside the line of what you can prove is wrong." She paused. "But this time he went on to Mercerland." "He did," Evelyn said, "and you can prove it." "With the right testimony, yes." Agnes was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the valley stretched out in its late summer brown, beautiful and dry and enormous. "What exactly do you need from me?" Agnes said. "Your account of where the water boundaries were understood to be when the valley was first settled," Evelyn said. "What the early ranchers agreed to. What your husband witnessed." Agnes nodded slowly. "My husband kept a journal," she said. "Most of it's dull, weather records and cattle numbers. But there's a section from 1863 where he wrote down the creek agreement between the families who were here first. Named names. Drew a rough map." She looked at Evelyn directly. "It has the Mercer family's water claim written in his own hand." The room was very quiet. "Would you be willing to present that at a hearing?" Evelyn said carefully. Agnes looked at her for a long moment, assessing, not unkindly. "Victor Hale buys things," she said finally. "He always has. He never could figure out that some things aren't for sale. My husband's journal isn't for sale. And neither is what I saw with my own eyes." She set her cup down. "Get me the paperwork. I'll sign it." Evelyn released a breath she hadn't quite known she was holding. They rode away from Agnes Tully's homestead with the old woman's commitment and the promise of the journal, and Cole said, in the quiet way he said things that mattered, 1. 6 to go, Evelyn said. He nodded. "Let's keep moving." The next two witnesses were easier. A neighboring rancher named Gus Fielder, who shared a boundary line with the Mercer North pasture, and had watched the creek run properly for 15 years before noticing the change, and an older hand named Hector Baines, who had worked the valley for 3 different outfits over 40 years and knew every waterway in it the way other men knew roads. Gus Fielder agreed almost before they finished explaining. He was a blunt, heavy-set man who'd had his own run-in with Hale over a fence dispute years back and had never forgotten the taste of it. "Hale moved my fence markers," Gus said, standing in his own yard with his arms crossed. 3 years ago. Just shifted them 40 feet west when I wasn't watching. By the time I caught it and complained, he had paperwork saying the line had always been where he put it. His jaw tightened. Couldn't prove otherwise. "Let it go." He looked at Evelyn. "I won't let it go this time. Tell me where to show up." Hector Baines was harder. Not because he was unwilling, but because he was scared. He was 67, retired from ranch work, living in a small house at the edge of Larkspur on a fixed income. When Cole and Evelyn came to his door and explained what they needed, Baines sat at his kitchen table for a long time without speaking. "Hale knows people in this town," Baines finally said. "He knows people in Billings. He knows people in the territorial administration." He looked up at them. "A man like me. If I go against him and it doesn't work out, I've got nowhere to fall." "I understand that," Evelyn said. She didn't try to minimize it. She'd learned early that people could tell when you were papering over their real concerns, and it only made them trust you less. "I'm not going to pretend it's without risk, but what you know about that creek is the truth, and the truth is what we need." Baines looked at Cole. "Who are you in all this?" "I work for Mrs. Mercer," Cole said. "Found the diversion, measured it." "You willing to testify yourself?" "Yes." Baines looked at his hands on the table. They were the hands of a man who'd worked outdoors his whole life. Rough, thick-knuckled, not built for anything delicate. "What I know about that creek goes back to 1871, he said quietly. I was a young man then. I helped lay the original markers when the Mercer family first established their claim on the North Bank. I was there. He paused. I've never told anyone that, because nobody ever asked. I'm asking, Evelyn said. Another long silence. Then Baines nodded, once, like a man stepping off a ledge he'd been standing at the edge of for a while. All right, he said. All right, I'll do it. They were 3 for 3, and the week wasn't done. The fourth witness was where it went wrong. A rancher named Douglas Pell ran a mid-sized operation 10 miles south of Larkspur. He knew the valley, knew the water history, and had attended the same territorial settlers meeting in 1879 where the creek rights had been formally discussed. Aldrich had found the meeting record in the territorial archive, and Pell's name was on the attendance list. His testimony could corroborate Agnes Tully's account directly. They rode out on a Thursday. Pell met them at his gate, which he didn't open. He was a tall man, thin in the way of someone who ate irregularly, with sun-weathered skin and eyes that moved between them and the road behind them with a nervous frequency that told her something had already happened. I heard you might come by, he said. Evelyn kept her voice neutral. Then you know what we're here about. I know. He looked at the road again. I also had a conversation yesterday with one of Hale's men, fella named Garrett. He said the name the way you say the name of something unpleasant. Garrett reminded me that I've got a grazing lease on the East Strip that runs across Hale's outer range. Said the lease comes up for renewal in November. Evelyn felt the shape of it immediately. He threatened your lease. He didn't threaten anything, Pell said, and the way he said it was almost careful, almost rehearsed. He just mentioned it, very friendly. His jaw was tight. I got 40 head that graze that strip, Mrs. Mercer. I lose that lease, I lose the pasture, and I lose a quarter of my herd's summer range. I know, she said. I'm sorry he put you in that position. It's not about sorry. Pell finally looked directly at her, and in his eyes was something that wasn't quite guilt, but was sitting right next to it. I got a wife and 3 kids. I can't fight Victor Hale on principle and feed my family on the outcome. His voice was rough. I can't do it. There was a long silence. Cole was very still beside her. All right, Douglas, she said quietly. I'm sorry, he said, and this time it meant something. She turned the horse, and they rode back down the road, and she didn't speak for almost a mile. Cole rode beside her and let the silence be what it needed to be. Finally, she said, He got to Pell before we did. Yes. Which means he knows who else might be on our list. Or he's going after everyone who could possibly be relevant, Cole said. Casting wide. He paused, which also means some of the people he approached said no to him. She looked at him. She hadn't thought of it that way. Pell said yes to the pressure, Cole said. That doesn't mean everyone did. She straightened in the saddle. Then we keep going. The 5th witness found them rather than the other way around. 2 days after the Pell disappointment, a man appeared at the Mercer Ranch gate on a gray horse, asking for Evelyn by name. He was in his late 50s, weathered, with a neatly kept beard and the quiet bearing of someone who'd once been in a position of authority and still carried the habit of it. His name was Edmund Ware, and he had been the territorial land surveyor for Larkspur County from 1870 to 1884. He sat in Thomas's office with his hat on his knee and told Evelyn, with no preamble, that he'd heard about the legal filing through Aldrich's clerk in Billings, and that he had something she needed to know. In 1878, he said, Victor Hale came to my office and asked me to resurvey the north boundary of what was then the early Mercer claim. He said there was ambiguity in the original markers. Ware's voice was measured. I surveyed it. There was no ambiguity. The boundary was exactly where the Mercer family had always said it was, including both banks of Larkspur Creek for the first 4 miles. He paused. Hale didn't like the result. He asked me to adjust the filed record. The room went very quiet. What did you do? Evelyn said. I told him no, Ware said simply. And I filed the accurate survey, which is still in the territorial records in Billings. He looked at her steadily. I've kept quiet about his request for 14 years because it seemed like a dead matter, and I had no desire to make an enemy of Victor Hale without reason. He paused. But what he's done to your water supply is not a dead matter, and I have the original survey notes in my possession. My working documents from that 1878 examination, including a written record of Hale's request and my refusal. Evelyn looked at this man she'd never met before today. "Why are you here?" she said, not suspiciously, genuinely. Ware was quiet for a moment. "Because I should have said something sooner," he said, "about a lot of things." He shrugged slightly. "I'm 61 years old. I'd rather not be 62 carrying this around." Evelyn called Cole in from the yard. She watched his face as Ware repeated the story and saw the same thing she'd felt. Not relief exactly, but the specific shift of a fight that's been defensive suddenly finding some ground to stand on. "The survey notes name Hale explicitly?" Cole asked. "By name," Ware said, "in my own handwriting." "And you're willing to testify to this at the hearing?" "That's why I'm here." Cole looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. Something passed between them that didn't need words. The recognition that what Ware had just laid on the table was not just testimony. It was evidence that Hale had known about the Mercer boundary claim for over a decade, had tried to alter the record, and had been refused. It turned the diversion from a property dispute into something closer to deliberate fraud. Aldrich, when they told him that evening, took off his spectacles and pinched the bridge of his nose. "This changes the case considerably," he said. "How considerably?" Evelyn asked. "If Ware's notes are what he says they are," Aldrich put his spectacles back on. "Hale can't claim ignorance of the boundary. He can't argue it was a genuine confusion about the survey line. It establishes intent." He paused. "That's not just a water rights matter anymore, Mrs. Mercer. That's actionable fraud." The week that followed was the most grueling of the entire 2 months. Cole and Evelyn rode out in different directions on different days, sometimes together, sometimes separately, covering ground that tested horses and patience equally. The weather had turned, not into rain, which they needed desperately, but into the kind of dry September heat that sits on the land like a lid, making everything heavier and slower. They found their sixth witness in a woman named Martha Sells, a retired school teacher who had come to the valley in 1875 and had, in her 20 years of teaching, accumulated a remarkable mental record of everything that happened in the community around her, the way school teachers often do, because people talked in front of teachers the way they talked in front of furniture. Martha had attended 3 separate community meetings at which Larkspur Creek water rights had been formally discussed, had kept her own notes from those meetings, and had no particular fear of Victor Hale because she had watched him as a younger man and had never been impressed by what she saw. "He was always looking for what he could get rather than what he could build," Martha said, sitting very straight in her parlor chair. "Even at 40, some men are like that. They want to accumulate rather than create." She looked at Evelyn with sharp, pale eyes. "You're a builder, I can tell." "I'm trying to be," Evelyn said. "That's all anyone can say," Martha replied. "Put me on your list." The 7th witness was the hardest and the most important, and Cole was the one who found him. His name was Josiah Reese, and he was 74 years old, a former ranch hand who had worked for Hale himself in the 1870s, before the relationship had soured over unpaid wages. He lived in a one-room house a mile outside of Larkspur and had been, by most accounts, drinking himself slowly into the ground for the better part of a decade. Cole went to him alone, on a Saturday, and was gone most of the day. When he came back, Evelyn was waiting at the porch. "Well," she said. Cole climbed down from his horse, and she could see the tiredness in him. Not physical tiredness, but the other kind, the kind that comes from a hard conversation. "He was there," Cole said, "when the diversion was built. He saw it." Evelyn felt her breath stop for a moment. "He was present." "He was working Hale's North Range crew the spring before last," said Hale brought in men from outside the valley, nobody local, to do the construction. Josiah was close enough to see what they were building. He didn't understand exactly what it meant at the time, or he told himself he didn't. Cole paused. He understood it well enough. "Will he testify?" Cole looked at her for a moment before answering, and she could see the complexity of what he was carrying. "He's scared," Cole said. "Not of Hale exactly. More of himself, of being in front of people, of what it means to admit you saw something and didn't speak." He paused. "I told him something." "What?" "I told him I'd stood by and watched something happen once too, because I didn't think it was my place to speak, and that there are 2 ways that ends. Either you stay quiet and carry it the rest of your life, or you say what you know and let the truth do what it does." Cole took his hat off, turned it in his hands. He thought about it for a while. And? He said he'd come to the hearing. Evelyn looked at him, at the tiredness in his face, and something else there too. Something older than this particular situation, some weight he'd been carrying before he ever arrived at Mercer Ranch. Whatever you said to him, she said, it came from somewhere real. He didn't answer that, just looked at the land, the way he did when he was thinking something he wasn't ready to say. The hearing was scheduled for the first week of October, before the Territorial Land Commissioner in the county courthouse in Larkspur. Aldrich had filed their complete evidence package, the land patent, Evelyn's sketches, Cole's measurements, Edmund Ware's original survey notes, and the written statements from 5 of their 7 witnesses, with Josiah Reese and Agnes Tully to appear in person. The week before the hearing, Hale made his final move. A letter arrived from Ellsworth Crane at the Larkspur Territorial Bank, formally notifying Evelyn that the note on the North Pasture acquisition had been reviewed and was being called due to a provision in the original loan terms that allowed the bank to accelerate repayment in cases of material change in the borrower's financial circumstances. She read the letter twice at the kitchen table, then she walked out to find Cole. He was at the watermark post by the creek, measuring again. The level had dropped another 2 fingers' width since the last measurement. The herd was thinner than she wanted to admit. The North Pasture was almost useless. She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it, handed it back. How long to pay it? He said. 90 days is the legal minimum he has to give me. He's giving me 60. Hearing is in 8 days. I know. He looked at the creek. The water moved slowly, weakly, a shadow of what it should have been. He's putting everything on the table at once, Cole said. The supply pressure, the banknote, trying to get to witnesses. He's not holding anything back. He turned to look at her. That's what a man does when he's worried. She hadn't thought of it that way either. She was starting to notice that Cole consistently offered her the angle she hadn't seen, not to reassure her, but because it was there and he thought she needed to know it. He's worried, she repeated. He filed counter-documentation with the commissioner's office yesterday, Cole said. Aldrich told me this morning. Hale's claiming the diversion is a natural formation and that the boundary line is genuinely disputed. He paused. His lawyer is arguing it's been there for years. Edmund Ware's survey notes predate that argument entirely. Yes, Cole said, they do. He turned fully toward her, and there was something in his face that was different from the careful steadiness he normally maintained. Something that had moved from professional commitment into something else she didn't quite have a name for yet. 8 days, he said. And we walk in there with 7 witnesses and documentation that goes back 30 years, and we put every piece of it in front of that commissioner, and we let the truth do what truth does when it's got enough weight behind it. Evelyn looked at him. At the creek. At the brown-edged land she'd been fighting for since the morning Thomas hadn't woken up. We're ready, she said, not because everything was fine, not because she wasn't afraid or exhausted or carrying the specific grief of knowing the ranch had suffered real damage that would take years to recover from. She said it because it was accurate. They had done the work. They had built the case. They had found the people willing to stand up, and those people had their own reasons for standing. Reasons that were true and earned and couldn't be bought off. The hearing was in 8 days. For the first time since the summer, Evelyn Mercer let herself believe it might be enough. The night before the hearing, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She'd expected that. She'd gone to bed at a reasonable hour, had lain in the dark with her eyes open, and after an hour of it, she stopped pretending and got up. She wrapped herself in the quilt from the foot of the bed, went to the kitchen, and sat at the table with a cup of water she didn't really want. The house was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass in long, slow waves, and somewhere in the distance, one of the cattle made a low sound and went silent again. The ranch existed around her the way it always had, breathing, animal, indifferent to what tomorrow held for the people who lived on it. She thought about Thomas, not in the sharp, breath-catching way she'd thought about him in the first weeks after he died, when grief was still something that ambushed her. This was different, quieter, more deliberate. She was thinking about him the way you think about someone whose absence has become a shape you've learned to navigate around. He would have known exactly what to do tomorrow. That was the truth of it. Thomas had been good at formal situations, composed, credible, the kind of man that commissioners and lawyers and bankers looked at and instinctively believed. Evelyn had always been the one who did the work behind the scenes, who figured out the problem and handed it to Thomas to present. They had been a good combination. Now she was both halves of it herself, and she was not entirely sure she was enough. She heard the back door of the bunkhouse open and close. The particular sound of it, the slight drag of the hinge that Walt had been meaning to fix for a year. Boots on the ground. She looked out the kitchen window and saw Cole cross the yard in the dark, not toward the barn, just standing, looking north the way he sometimes did when she caught him in an unguarded moment. She watched him for a moment, then she put on her coat over the quilt and went out. The cold hit her immediately. October in Montana had stopped playing at autumn and started meaning it, and the air had a bite that said winter was practicing somewhere close by. Cole turned when he heard her step on the porch, and he didn't look surprised to see her, which she appreciated. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "No," he said. She came down the porch steps and stood beside him, looking north toward the dark ridge. The sky was enormous and full of stars, the kind of sky that made you feel the specific smallness of your own life without making it feel bad exactly. "Are you worried about tomorrow?" she said. He thought about it honestly, which was how he did things. "Not about the evidence," he said. "The evidence is what it is. Ware's notes are solid. Josiah saw what he saw. Agnes has the journal." He paused. "I'm worried about the commissioner. Aldrich says he's a fair man." "Aldrich says he's been fair in cases he's handled before," Cole said. "That's not exactly the same thing. A case with Victor Hale on one side and a recently widowed woman on the other, in a county where Hale has had influence for 30 years. He didn't finish it, but he didn't need to." "I know," she said. They stood in the cold for a moment without speaking. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "The thing you said to Josiah Reese about watching something happen and not speaking. What were you talking about?" She looked at him sideways. "You don't have to tell me." Cole was quiet long enough that she thought he might simply not answer. Then he looked up at the stars instead of at her, which was sometimes how people talked about things they hadn't said in a long time. "I had a partner," he said, "when I had the place up near Yellowstone. Man named Frank Dubrow. We'd worked together for years before we went in on the operation together." He paused. Frank started skimming. "From the ranch accounts, from our shared expenses. Small amounts at first. I noticed and I told myself I was wrong, or that it wasn't as bad as it looked, or that I'd talk to him about it when the time was right." His voice was even, but the evenness was the kind that's maintained. "By the time I said something, we were 6 months from losing everything. The conversation didn't go well. Frank left, took what he could, and went. I tried to run it alone and couldn't." He paused. "Lost the place by spring." Evelyn looked at his profile in the dark. "You've been watching me deal with Hale the same way," she said slowly. "Someone taking something that isn't theirs while the person it belongs to is supposed to not notice or not say anything." "Or wait too long," he said. "You didn't want that to happen again." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I didn't." She turned that over in the cold dark. The thing about Cole, the thing she'd been circling for weeks without quite landing on, was that he wasn't here out of obligation. He wasn't here because he had nowhere else to go. He was here because something in this specific situation had reached into whatever he'd been carrying around since Yellowstone and said, "This time, do the thing you didn't do before. This time, stay." "I'm glad you didn't leave," she said, simply, without dressing it up. He looked at her then, and something in his face was different from the careful steadiness he kept, open in a way that was brief and real and gone again quickly, like a door swinging and catching itself. "We should both try to sleep," he said. "Probably," she agreed. Neither of them moved for another minute, standing in the cold Montana night with the stars overhead and the ridge dark to the north and the hearing 8 hours away. Then she went back inside, and he went back to the bunkhouse, and the ranch breathed around them in the dark. The courthouse in Larkspur was a 2-story wooden building at the center of town that served as meeting hall, administrative office, and occasional church space depending on what the week required. On the morning of the hearing, it was full. Evelyn hadn't expected that. She'd expected a formal proceeding. The commissioner, the lawyers, the witnesses, a handful of observers. What she found when she arrived was a room packed with people from the valley, most of whom she recognized and none of whom had announced they were coming. Farmers and ranchers and shopkeepers and their wives, filling the benches that had been arranged facing a long table at the front of the room where the commissioner would sit. She stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it in. Walt appeared at her shoulder. "Word gets around," he said quietly. "People know what this is about." Victor Hale was already seated at one of the two tables set up before the commissioner's bench, with his lawyer, a man named Rourke, who had come from Billings and had the pressed, expensive look of someone who understood exactly what his fees were and what they were worth, sitting beside him. Hale himself was in a dark suit, gray-haired and composed, and he looked across the room at Evelyn when she entered with the particular stillness of a man who has been powerful long enough that he no longer needs to perform it. She looked back at him without looking away first. Then she walked to her own table where Aldrich was already arranging documents in the order they'd discussed, his spectacles on his forehead the way they always were until the moment he actually needed to read. Cole came in behind her with the witnesses. Agnes Tully in a chair her granddaughter Ruth had insisted on carrying in, Josiah Reese in a clean shirt that looked like it had been ironed recently and awkwardly, Edmund Ware with his satchel of original survey documents, and Gus Fielder standing in the back with his hat in his hands because there weren't enough seats, and he'd offered his to a woman he didn't know. The Territorial Land Commissioner was a man named Arthur Briggs, 60 years old, rail-thin, with a white mustache and the permanently preoccupied expression of someone who had been deciding other people's arguments for so long that he'd developed a mild allergy to drama. He came in from a side door, sat at the center of the long table, looked at the room over his spectacles, and said, without particular inflection, "We'll begin." Rourke went first, for Hale. He was good. Evelyn had to acknowledge that. He was smooth and organized, and he made the argument sound almost reasonable, that the boundary survey of the Mercer land was imprecise at the northern edge, that the water diversion in question had developed naturally over time as creek behavior changed, that there was genuine historical ambiguity about the water rights in this section of the valley, and that his client had done nothing more than make beneficial use of water that was flowing naturally across his land. He spoke for 40 minutes. He was confident and well-prepared, and he never looked at Evelyn once, which she understood was a deliberate choice. Treating her as irrelevant was part of the argument he was making. Then Aldrich stood up. Calvin Aldrich did not have Rourke's polish. He was shorter, older, with a slightly rumpled quality that made him look like the less impressive option in the room. Evelyn had spent 2 months watching him work, and she'd long since stopped being fooled by the surface of him. He began with the land patent, read the relevant section aloud in his steady, quiet voice, established the date, the witness signatures, the surveyor's seal. Then he placed it in front of Commissioner Briggs and moved on without theatrics. He presented Evelyn's sketches and Cole's measurements. He walked through the timeline, when the water had started running low, when Cole had found the diversion, what the structure consisted of, and what it was doing to the creek flow. He did it methodically, without raising his voice, and the room listened with the particular quality of attention that comes when people understand they're hearing something real. Then he called Edmund Ware. Ware sat before Commissioner Briggs with his satchel open on the table, and he told his story the same way he'd told it to Evelyn in Thomas's office, plainly, precisely, without embellishment. He produced his original 1878 survey notes, identified each page in his own handwriting, and read aloud the section where he had recorded Victor Hale's request to alter the boundary record. The room was very quiet. Rourke objected twice. Briggs overruled him both times with the weary efficiency of a man who had heard better objections. Then came Josiah Reese. Evelyn had been watching Josiah since he'd arrived. He had the look of a man who hadn't been in a formal public setting in a long time. Uncomfortable in his chair, hands wrapped around each other on the table, eyes that moved around the room without settling. When Aldrich called his name, he stood up too fast and had to catch the edge of the table. She watched Cole, who was seated along the wall. Cole was watching Josiah the same way. Steady, not anxious, the kind of attention that was meant to be felt across a room. Josiah sat down before Briggs and stated his name and his connection to the Hale operation. Then Aldrich asked him to describe what he had seen during the construction of the diversion. And Josiah Reese, who had been carrying this for 2 years and had spent the last decade blurring the edges of things he'd rather not see clearly, told the truth. He said it plainly and without theatrical weight, which was somehow worse for Hale than if he'd said it dramatically. He described the outside crew Hale had brought in. He described watching them work. He described understanding, gradually, what the structure was and what it was doing. He described saying nothing because he needed the work, and because Victor Hale was not a man you complicated your life by contradicting. "Did Mr. Hale supervise this construction personally?" Aldrich asked. "He came out twice that I saw," Josiah said. "Looked it over, talked to the foreman of the outside crew, seemed satisfied." He paused. "He knew what they were building, there's no question about that." Rourke cross-examined him for 20 minutes, going after his credibility, his drinking, his time away from steady work, the years since he'd left Hale's employ. Josiah took it. He was not a proud man, and he knew it, and he didn't pretend otherwise. He just kept saying the same thing in different ways. He was there. He saw it. That was what happened. When Rourke was done, Josiah stood up from the witness chair, walked back to his seat, and sat down heavily. He looked at his hands. Cole, from across the room, gave him a single nod. Nothing elaborate, just an acknowledgement. Josiah straightened his back a little. Agnes Tully was last among the witnesses. Ruth wheeled her chair to the front of the room, and Agnes sat before Commissioner Briggs with the quilt over her legs and the leather journal on her lap, and she looked around the room once, taking it all in with the unhurried attention of someone who has outlasted most of the urgency in her life. And then she looked at Briggs. "Mrs. Tully," Aldrich said, "could you describe the journal you've brought with you today?" "My husband's," she said. Her voice was still clear. That had always been remarkable about Agnes, that her voice had kept its clarity even as the rest of her had softened and slowed. "Edgar Tully. He kept it from 1859 until 1881. He wrote down what he observed because he believed that what happens on a piece of land matters, and someone should keep track of it." She smoothed one hand over the cover. He was right about that. Aldrich asked her to read the relevant passage. She opened to a page marked with a folded piece of paper and read in her steady voice from Edgar Tully's handwriting, a record from August 1863, describing a meeting of the valley's earliest settlers at which the water rights of Larkspur Creek had been discussed and agreed upon. The record named the Mercer family, Thomas's father, James Mercer, as holding the established right to the north bank of the creek for the first 4 miles, by prior claim and prior use, as acknowledged by all parties present. She read it without looking up, and when she was done, she closed the journal and held it in both hands. The room was very quiet. Commissioner Briggs looked at the journal for a long moment. Then he wrote something on the paper in front of him, and his expression didn't change, but something in the angle of his pen did. Rourke made his closing argument. It was shorter than his opening and less confident. The kind of argument that knows it's behind and is doing the math on how far. Aldrich's closing was 3 minutes long. He simply listed what had been established: the original land patent, the 1878 survey confirming the boundary, Hale's documented attempt to alter that survey, the physical evidence of a deliberate structure built on Mercer land, and an eyewitness account of that construction being supervised by Victor Hale personally. He asked Commissioner Briggs to restore the Mercer water rights and to order the removal of the diversion structure at Hale's expense. Then he sat down. Commissioner Briggs did not deliberate for long. He was the kind of man who formed his conclusions as the evidence came in rather than at the end, and by the time Aldrich sat down, Briggs had already made up his mind. He looked at his notes. He looked at the journal that Agnes Tully still held in her lap. He looked at Edmund Ware's survey documents on the table. Then he said, in the tone of a man reading from an internal text he'd already finished writing, "The evidence before this commission establishes, to a clear preponderance, that the water rights to Larkspur Creek's north bank for the first 4 miles belong to the Mercer property by prior claim, established survey, and historical agreement among the valley's founding settlers. The structure in question is an unauthorized modification of water flow on Mercer land. The respondent is ordered to remove said structure within 30 days at his own expense. Water rights are hereby confirmed in the name of the Mercer property, and any future interference with said water rights will be subject to the full penalties applicable under territorial land law." He set his pen down. "This matter is decided." He said it the same way he'd said everything, without drama, without performance. The room did not erupt. It exhaled. That was the only way to describe it. A long, collective release of breath, like a room that had been holding itself together and could finally let go. Evelyn sat very still at the table. She heard Walt somewhere behind her make a low sound. She heard Agnes Tully say something quietly to Ruth. She heard the chair legs scrape as people began to move. She didn't move yet. She sat with her hands flat on the table in front of her and looked at the commissioner's bench, now empty because Briggs had already gone back through his side door. And she thought about the word decided, the way it landed, the specific weight of it. Across the room, Victor Hale stood, buttoned his jacket, said something quiet to Rourke, and walked out through the main doors without looking at her. Not fast, not slow. Just gone. Like a man who had taken his loss privately and intended to process it privately, which was perhaps the only dignified thing about him in that moment. Aldrich put a hand on her arm. "Evelyn," he said, "it's done." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "It is." She stood up. Her legs were steadier than she'd expected. She turned to find Cole and found him already there. Not rushing over, not making an event of it, just standing close, the way he'd positioned himself throughout, present without intruding. "You heard?" she said. "I heard," he said. She looked at him, and there was nothing either of them said for a moment that was adequate, so they didn't say anything. Walt came through the crowd and clapped her on the shoulder with a hand that was trembling slightly, which was the most emotional she had ever seen the old foreman, and she put her own hand over his and held it for a second. Josiah Reese appeared at the edge of the group, hat in his hands, looking like a man who had just set down something heavy and wasn't sure yet what to do with the empty hands. "Mr. Reese," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. "What you did today, I just told what I saw," he said. His voice was rough. "Should have told it sooner." "You told it when it counted," she said. "That's what matters." He nodded once, looked at the floor, and slipped back through the crowd before she could say anything else. Outside the courthouse, the October air hit her like a reminder that the world existed beyond the last 2 hours. The street had a handful of people on it who had come out from the hearing, standing in small groups, talking in the particular low tone of people processing something unexpected. Clara Bates crossed the street toward her. She came quickly, with purpose, and when she reached Evelyn, she took both her hands. "I'm sorry I couldn't do more," Clara said. Her eyes were bright. "Earlier, when I told you about Hale and the bank, I wanted to do more and I was afraid." "You warned me," Evelyn said. "That mattered." "Still," Clara squeezed her hands and let go. "You should be proud of yourself. Thomas would—" She stopped. "I'm sorry." "No," Evelyn said quietly. "I know what you were going to say. And yes, I think he would." Clara went back to her store. Evelyn stood on the street for a moment, letting the air work on her. Cole came to stand beside her. He was looking down the street toward the far end of town, where Hale's horses were tied outside the hotel. Hale's man loading things into the wagon with the particular efficiency of someone who'd been told to make it quick. "He'll contest it," Cole said. "Not here. He'll take it to the territorial level." "Aldrich said he might," Evelyn said. "He also said the survey notes from Ware make a territorial appeal almost impossible to sustain." She paused. "Almost." "Almost," Cole agreed. "We'll deal with that if it comes." She looked at him sideways. "Are you going somewhere?" He turned to look at her directly. "I don't know," he said. It was honest in a way that cost him something. "You don't know," she repeated. "I hadn't thought past today," he said. "I was thinking about the hearing." She looked at him, at the set of his face, the way he held himself, always slightly apart, even when he was fully present. She thought about what he'd told her in the cold dark the night before, about the place near Yellowstone, about Frank DeBrow, about losing everything in the wrong order, about how a person could get used to traveling light because traveling light meant there was nothing to take from you. "Cole," she said. "Yeah." "You fixed the south fence in 3 days when Walt said it would take a week and a half," she said. "You reorganized the rotation so we didn't lose more cattle than we did. You found the diversion when nobody else was looking for it. You found Josiah Reese when nobody else would have known to look." She paused. "The ranch that got us to today, that's partly yours. And the ranch that comes after today needs someone who understands that." He looked at her for a moment, then back down the street. "I'm a hired hand," he said. But the way he said it sounded like a man trying out an argument he already suspected wasn't going to hold. "You're a man who decided to stay when staying was harder than leaving," she said. "That's not nothing. That's not even close to nothing. A long pause. The street was quiet around them. The sky over Larkspur was the particular pale blue of an October morning, enormous and cold and indifferent the way Montana sky always was. And underneath it the town went about its business. And somewhere to the west the Mercer Ranch sat on its 10,000 acres, with the creek running low but running. And 30 days from now someone would dismantle a timber structure 4 miles up that creek, and the water would move the way it was supposed to move, and the land would begin to come back. "The banknote," Cole said. "The one Crane called due." "I'll deal with it," she said. "The legal ruling gives me standing to challenge the acceleration on grounds of bad faith. Aldrich thinks it'll be dismissed." She paused. "It'll take time, but it's manageable now." He nodded slowly. "The east wing roof still leaks," she said. He almost laughed. It wasn't a full laugh. It was a small, real thing that crossed his face briefly and disappeared. "I know," he said. "I've been looking at it. And the south pasture fence still has 3 sections that need replacing before winter." "I know that too." "Then you have things to do," she said. "If you want to stay and do them." He looked at her then, directly, without the usual careful management of what he was showing. She looked back at him the same way. No performance in it, no pretending the question was smaller than it was. She was asking him to choose, and they both knew it, and she was not going to dress it up as anything else. He said, "I want to stay." 3 words. Not decorated, just the truth of them, said by a man who had spent years not saying this kind of thing and felt the weight of it in the saying. She nodded. "Good," she said. They stood there on the street for another moment, close enough that the cold between them had mostly gone. Then she said, "The wagon's hitched. Walt's waiting. Let's go home." And they walked back toward the wagon, and the courthouse behind them held the echo of a decision that could not be undone. And ahead of them the road ran west through the brown hills toward the ranch, and the sky stayed enormous and cold and indifferent overhead, which was fine. They didn't need the sky to care. They had each other, and they had the land, and they had the work that was still in front of them. That was enough to begin with. The crew dismantled the diversion on a cold Thursday in early November, 3 days before the 30-day deadline Hale had been given. Cole rode out with Samuel and Hector Vance to watch it come down. Not because they needed supervision, but because after everything that structure had cost them, it felt wrong to let it disappear without witnesses. Hale had sent 4 men to do the work. Quiet, efficient, nobody Evelyn recognized from the valley. They worked without speaking much and had the timber and stone cleared by midday. When the last piece came out, the creek moved differently almost immediately. Not dramatically. Water doesn't perform for an audience. But Cole crouched at the bank and watched the flow change, felt the pressure increase against his fingers where he held them at the edge. Stronger. Still not what it should be, still carrying the damage of months of reduced flow, but moving the way it was meant to move. He stood up and looked at Samuel. "It'll take time," Samuel said. "It will," Cole agreed. They rode home in the afternoon light, and Cole told Evelyn what he'd seen, and she listened at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and she didn't say much. She just nodded and looked out the window at the north pasture and said, "Good." 1 word, but the way she said it carried the weight of everything that word had taken to earn. The banknote was resolved 11 days after the hearing, when Aldrich filed a formal challenge to the acceleration clause on grounds of bad faith dealing. Ellsworth Crane, facing a legal argument that would require him to explain his timing and his relationship with Victor Hale in open court, withdrew the acceleration notice within a week. He sent a letter through his lawyer, brief, formal, without apology, reinstating the original repayment terms. Evelyn read the letter, set it on Thomas's desk next to the land patent, and went back to work. There was a great deal of work. The ranch had taken real damage from the summer. Not fatal damage, but the kind that shows up in the details. The herd was lighter than it should have been for October. 2 of the north pasture sections would need reseeding in spring. The cattle that had spent the summer on reduced water would take a full year to fully recover their condition. These were not small problems. They were the problems of a place that had fought hard and won, and still had to deal with the cost of the fight. Cole understood this kind of recovery. He'd watched it fail once, on his own land, because he hadn't had enough time or enough help or enough of the right decisions in the right order. He understood it differently now, not with the desperate optimism of someone who needed things to work out, but with the practical attention of someone who knew exactly what needed doing and was willing to do it. He fixed the east wing roof in October, working 3 days on it with Danny Pruitt, who had turned into a genuinely useful hand over the summer in the way that young people do when they're given real responsibility and not humiliated when they make mistakes. The roof held through the first November rain without a single drip into the east bedroom, which was a small thing that felt large. He replaced the 3 south fence sections before the ground froze. He reorganized the winter feed storage with Walt, and the two of them had the kind of quiet argument about hay arrangement that men who respect each other have when they disagree on practical things. Back and forth, neither completely yielding, ending in a compromise that was probably better than either original position. Walt's hip was bad through most of November. He didn't complain about it, which was how Evelyn knew it was worse than usual. "You need to see the doctor," she told him one morning when she caught him moving with the particular careful slowness of someone managing pain. "I've seen doctors," Walt said. "They tell me the same thing every time." "What do they tell you?" "That I'm 61 and I fell off a horse 5 years ago and I should rest it." He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has reached the age where he's stopped pretending to find certain kinds of advice useful. "I'll rest it in February when there's less to do." "You'll rest it now," she said. "Cole and Samuel can handle the morning rotation." Walt looked at her for a long moment. The look of an old foreman who had worked for someone else for 20 years and was still sometimes surprised when that someone else made a decision he couldn't argue with. "Thomas used to back down when I pushed," he said. "I know," she said. "I watched him do it." Walt almost smiled. "Fine," he said. "A few days." He took 2 weeks and came back moving better, and didn't thank her for it because Walt wasn't built for that. But he started fixing the bunkhouse door hinge that had been dragging for a year, and she understood that was the same thing. December came hard, the way Montana winters do when they've been patient long enough. The first real snow hit the valley in the first week of the month, and within days the landscape that had spent the summer brown and desperate became white and enormous and very quiet. The cattle moved to the winter pasture. The creek froze at its edges but kept running at the center, which was what they needed: ice at the margins, water underneath, the way things survive in cold country. It was during a snowstorm in the second week of December that Cole and Evelyn had the conversation they'd been circling since the night before the hearing. She'd come out to the barn to check on a heifer that had been showing signs of early labor. Premature, possibly, though Walt thought she might pull through if the night wasn't too cold. Cole was already there, sitting on an overturned bucket near the stall, watching the heifer with the particular patience of someone who understood that some things required only presence. Evelyn sat down on a hay bale nearby. The snow hit the barn roof in waves, and the wind moved around the outside walls with a sound like something large breathing. They watched the heifer for a while without talking. "She's going to be all right," Cole said eventually. He said it like someone stating a fact rather than offering comfort, and she appreciated the distinction. "I think so too," she said. Another minute passed. "I've been thinking," she said. "About what?" She looked at him. He was watching the heifer, his forearms on his knees, his hat pushed back on his head. There was snow on his jacket from coming in from outside, melting slowly in the barn warmth. "About what this place is," she said. "What it's going to be." She paused, working through it. When Thomas was alive, the ranch was his idea, his father's before him, and then his. I helped build it. I worked it as hard as he did. But the vision of it was his. I knew what he wanted it to become. She looked at her hands. "I've been running it for 6 months now, and I keep waiting to feel like I know what I want it to become. Not just keep it alive, not just hold it against people who want to take it, but actually build it into something." Cole turned to look at her now. "What do you want it to be?" he said. She'd thought about this more than she'd told anyone. Bigger herd managed better, Mug. Not more cattle than the land can carry, but the right number, healthy, well-rotated. The north pasture reseeded properly in spring. I want to build a second water trough system on the south range so we're not entirely dependent on the creek flow during dry years. She paused. "And I want to hire 3 more hands by spring. Good ones, who'll stay." "Danny's good," Cole said. "Danny's excellent," she agreed. He just needs 2 or 3 men beside him who know what they're doing." Cole was quiet for a moment. "That's a real plan," he said. "It's the beginning of one." "What else?" She looked at him. "I want to know if you're part of it, she said. Not as a hired hand, as something else. The barn was warm and smelled of hay and animals, and the particular earthy closeness of a working space in winter. The heifer shifted in her stall. The snow kept hitting the roof. Cole looked at the ground between his boots for a moment. She'd noticed he did this when he was dealing with something real. Looked at the ground first, like he needed a second to locate himself before he could respond to what was actually being asked. What I said outside the courthouse, he said, that I wanted to stay. Yes. I meant it the way it sounded, he said. Not just working, staying. He looked up at her. But I'm not Thomas. I know you're not Thomas, she said. I'm not asking for Thomas. What are you asking for? She thought about how to say it accurately rather than easily. Someone who tells me the truth, she said, who works the land because he believes in what we're building on it, not because he's waiting for somewhere better to go, who... She stopped, started again. Someone who chooses to be here, every day, not because he has to. He looked at her for a long time. I'm not easy to know, he said finally. I don't talk a lot about what I'm thinking. I forget to say things that probably need saying. I'm better with a fence line than I am with... He gestured vaguely at the space between them. I noticed, she said. That doesn't bother you? Cole, she said, with the slight exasperation of a woman who has thought about this enough to be past the questioning stage. You found the diversion. You rode the creek in the dark. You talked Josiah Reese out of his chair and into that courthouse. You fixed my roof. She paused. You show what you mean by what you do. I understand that kind of language just fine. Something happened in his face. Not dramatic. This was Cole. Nothing he did was dramatic, but real. The wall that he kept in a particular position shifted slightly, and what was behind it was a person who had been alone for a long time and was standing at the edge of not being. There's something I should tell you, he said. Tell me, she said. When I came into Larkspur that day, when you found me at the trough, I wasn't just passing through. He paused. I'd heard about the Mercer Ranch, about Thomas dying, about the situation. He looked at her carefully, watching for how this landed. I'd worked in this valley years ago, before your time here. I knew what the land was. I came because I thought there might be work, and I thought it might be a place worth putting down again. She absorbed this. You came on purpose, she said. Yes. You weren't just a drifter who happened to be on that trough. No. He held her gaze. I should have said it sooner. I didn't know how to without it sounding like something it wasn't. She thought about it honestly. The way it would have sounded in the first days. A man who'd shown up knowing who she was and what she was dealing with. She could see why he'd held it back. She could also see that he was telling her now, which was the choice that mattered. You stayed because you wanted to, she said. Not because you had nowhere else to go. Yes. And the rest of it, everything since, that was real. All of it, he said. Every bit of it. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, All right. All right, he repeated. That's all I needed to know, she said. The heifer made a low sound in the stall, and Cole stood up and checked on her, and the labor that had seemed early turned out to be on time. Slightly before expected, but not dangerously so. And by the time the snow had eased outside and the wind had dropped to a murmur against the barn walls, there was a calf on the hay that hadn't been there before, wet and blinking and already working to stand on legs that weren't sure yet what they were for. They married in February, the way people in cold country sometimes do things in winter, practically, without waiting for better weather. Aldrich came from Billings and stood as a witness. Walt stood beside Cole, wearing a jacket Evelyn was certain he'd borrowed from someone because she'd never seen it before. Agnes Tully came with Ruth, the leather journal on her lap, though nobody had asked her to bring it. She brought it because she believed in the recording of things. The ceremony was in the main house, in the front room that Thomas had always meant to properly furnish and never quite had. It was still spare. A table, some chairs, the iron stove working hard against the February cold. Not the setting anyone would have designed, just the setting that was there. Evelyn wore her own dress, not black. She'd been deliberate about that. A dark green wool that had been in her trunk for 3 years, purchased on a trip to Billings she and Thomas had taken before everything got complicated. She'd never worn it. She put it on that morning and stood in front of the bedroom mirror for a long moment, And what she felt wasn't grief exactly, and it wasn't pure joy either. It was something more complicated than both. The feeling of a person who is standing at a real threshold and is honest enough with herself to know that thresholds always face two directions at once. Cole stood in the front room in a clean shirt and his least worn jacket, and when she came down the stairs, he looked at her the way people look at things they intend to pay close attention to for a long time. "You look," he started. "Don't say something easy," she said. He almost smiled. "I was going to say you look like yourself." She considered that. "All right," she said, "that's accurate." The ceremony was short and plain, and the words that mattered were said and witnessed, and afterward Walt poured something from a bottle he had also apparently borrowed from someone, and they stood in the front room of the spare house on the Montana frontier in February. And it was not elegant, and it was not what anyone would have planned, and it was exactly what it needed to be. Spring came the way it always comes in that country. Not gently, but insistently, pushing through the last resistance of winter with a kind of stubborn force that feels personal. The snow retreated from the south-facing slopes first, then from the valley floor, and then the creek, freed from its ice, ran with the clarity of snowmelt and the force of months of accumulation. It ran properly. Both banks, the way it always should have. By April, the north pasture showed the first green at its edges. Not recovered, not yet, but the beginning of recovery, which is its own kind of thing. Cole had the reseeding done in 3 sections, spread across the weeks as the ground allowed it. Samuel and Hector Vance took on more responsibility as the operation expanded. Danny Pruitt hired 2 men he knew from a previous outfit. Young, willing, not experienced enough to be proud about learning. Cole worked with them directly, and Evelyn watched from a distance on some days the way you watch something that is becoming what you hoped it would be. And try not to put too much pressure on by hoping too obviously. The additional water trough system on the South Range was built in May. Cole designed it, Evelyn approved the placement, and the crew ran the line together over 4 days in weather that couldn't make up its mind between spring and leftover winter. It worked. Not perfectly. There was a joint that leaked in the second section and had to be refitted, and the flow pressure was lower at the far end than Cole had calculated. But it worked well enough, and by summer the southern cattle had water they could rely on without competing for the creek access. Gus Fielder stopped by in June, passing on his way back from town, and stood at the fence line looking at the north pasture with the appraising eye of a man who knew what damaged land looks like and could see the difference. "Coming back," he said. "Slowly," Evelyn said. "Slow's all right," Gus said. "Slow means it's real." He rode on, and she stood at the fence and looked at the pasture and thought he was right about that. The things that come back slowly are usually the things that stay. Victor Hale filed his territorial appeal in March, as Cole had predicted he would. Aldrich handled it from Billings, and Evelyn never had to appear personally. The appeal was dismissed in July, quietly, without drama, in a written ruling from the Territorial Commissioner's office that essentially said the original hearing had been correctly decided and that the evidence of Edmund Ware's survey notes made the boundary question beyond reasonable dispute. Aldrich sent her a letter with the ruling attached and a single line at the bottom. That's the end of it. She read the letter at the kitchen table, set it down, and went back to the account she'd been working on. There was a moment, walking out to the barn that evening, when she thought about Hale. Not with satisfaction exactly, and not with residual anger. More with the detached observation of someone who has been through something and come out the other side changed in ways they're still finding. Victor Hale had believed, probably sincerely, that what he was doing was simply the natural order, that water and land moved toward the capable and away from the weak, and that there was no moral dimension to it, only the logic of power. He had been wrong about that, not in a complicated way. Just wrong, the way people are wrong when they mistake the absence of resistance for the absence of worth. He'd met resistance, and he'd lost. She didn't know what he'd done after, whether he'd redirected his attention to some other acquisition, whether he'd become more careful or simply more patient. She didn't spend much time on it. Hale was someone who had occupied her life for a season and was now simply part of the history of the land, like the drought, like the lean summer, like everything that had happened and been survived. By fall, the first anniversary of Thomas's death, the ranch was something she recognized, not the same thing it had been when Thomas was alive. Different. Her own now in a way that was harder to explain than it sounded, because it wasn't about ownership of the deed, which had always been in her name too. It was about the vision of it, the plan, the decisions made in her own judgment about what this place was going to become and how it was going to get there. Those had always been partly hers, but now they were entirely hers. And that distinction turned out to matter more than she'd expected. She stood on the eastern ridge, the same ridge where Thomas had been buried, where the grave still was, marked with a stone she'd had brought from Billings in the spring, and looked out over the valley in the October afternoon light. The herd was in better condition than it had been in 3 years. The north pasture had come back further than she'd dared plan for. The creek ran the way a creek was supposed to run. The bunkhouse had 5 men in it who came to work every morning without being asked twice, and 2 of them, Danny Pruitt included, had started talking about whether there might be a future for them in this valley if the operation kept growing the way it was growing. Cole came up the ridge behind her. She heard him before she saw him. The particular sound of his walk, which she'd learned the way you learn the sounds of a house you've lived in long enough to love. He came to stand beside her. They looked at the valley together for a while. Walt says the South Range cattle are carrying better weight going into winter than they have in 5 years, he said. I know, she said. He told me 3 times. He's proud of the trough system. He's pretending it was his idea. Cole almost laughed, that small, real thing that crossed his face briefly. Let him, he said. She leaned against him slightly, and he didn't make anything of it, just stayed where he was, solid, present. Below them the valley went gold and brown in the fall light, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, the way only land that doesn't need you to find it beautiful can be. The creek caught the light where it moved. The cattle were small, dark shapes in the pasture. The house sat where it had always sat, with the east wing roof holding against whatever the sky decided to send, and smoke coming from the chimney because someone had started the stove. Evelyn thought about what she would have said a year ago if someone had told her this was where she'd be. She thought she would have said, prove it. Not because she'd doubted herself, because she'd known it wouldn't be simple, and she'd wanted to be sure that whoever was telling her was honest about that. It hadn't been simple. It had been the hardest year of her life, and she wasn't going to sand that down into something easier to carry. The drought and the water theft and the legal fight and the fear she'd felt some nights in that kitchen with the accounts in front of her that didn't add up, she wasn't going to pretend those hadn't been real. They had been real. They had cost her things she was still counting. But here was the other thing that was real. You find out what you're made of not when everything is working, but when everything is breaking, and you're still there at the end of it, making decisions, choosing who to trust, choosing to fight, choosing, when the courthouse let out and a man said he wanted to stay, to believe him. You find out who you are by watching what you do when it matters. She knew now. Cole turned to look at her sideways. You're thinking loudly, he said. Am I? She said. What are you thinking about? She looked at the valley, at all of it, the whole wide breathing thing of it. That we have a lot of work to do before winter, she said. He nodded. We do. And that it doesn't bother me, she said. The work. It used to sometimes feel like weight. Now it just feels like what there is to do. He understood what she was saying without her having to explain the layers of it. He said, yeah, in that quiet way, and she knew he meant it. They stood there a little longer. The light dropped. The valley went a deeper gold, then started toward shadow the way evenings do, steadily, without hurry, taking its time. Then they went back down the ridge together, back toward the work that was waiting, and the house with smoke coming from the chimney, and the land that was theirs to build on for as long as they were willing to build. That was enough, more than enough. That was everything.